Uncovering the mystery of the lost tribes. What if I told you that some of the descendants of ancient Israel, the very people God called his own, could be living among us today? What if they've been scattered across the earth, their identities lost in the sands of time, yet their purpose and destiny still waiting to be discovered? This isn't some ancient fairy tale or a piece of lost history buried in dusty scrolls. This is a story that's alive. It's a story of God's people, his chosen tribes, scattered into the corners of the world. But here's the thing, the story is far from over. In fact, it might just be unfolding right now before our eyes. The lost tribes of Israel, they're not lost in the sense that they've disappeared entirely. They are lost in the sense that they've been hidden from us, scattered across the nations, their identities obscured, but their spiritual legacy still vibrant and pulsing with the power of God's promises. You've heard the stories, seen the documentaries, and maybe even wondered if these tribes are just myths, like something out of a biblical treasure hunt. But what if there's more? What if you and I could be part of a divine journey, one that connects us to these tribes, not just through history, but through the very promises God made to Israel? Today, we're going to dive deep into this mystery, the mystery of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. We'll walk through history, examine prophecies, and even explore modern-day claims of their identity. But most importantly, we'll uncover why it matters to you, why it matters to us as believers in Christ. Because this story isn't just about Israel's past, it's about God's promise to all his people, and how that promise still resonates in the world today. So grab your seat and open your heart. The journey to discover the lost tribes of Israel is one of mystery, faith, and fulfillment. It's a journey that will reveal how God's story of restoration and redemption is still being written, and how you might just be part of it. Let's start. 1. The origins of the 12 tribes of Israel. To understand the lost tribes of Israel, we need to go back, way back, to the beginning, to a man named Jacob, later known as Israel. God changed his name after a pivotal moment in his life, where he wrestled with an angel through the night and emerged victorious. Jacob's story is one of transformation, one of struggle, and ultimately, one of God's covenant promises to him. Jacob had 12 sons, each of whom would become the father of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. These 12 sons were the foundation of the nation that God had set apart for himself. Now let's stop for a second. When we talk about these tribes, we're not just talking about distant relatives or ancient history. We're talking about God's chosen people, each tribe with its own story, blessings, and destinies. And each tribe was part of a divine plan. Let's take a brief look at the 12 sons of Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Each one carried not only a family lineage, but also a prophetic blessing from their father. Some of these blessings were promises of greatness, some of wealth and abundance, and some were even warnings of challenges ahead. For instance, Judah's blessing was powerful. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. Genesis 49:10. This was the prophecy that one day the Messiah would come from the line of Judah, Jesus himself. On the other hand, the tribe of Dan, though blessed, was warned of their rebellious tendencies, a foreshadowing of their future troubles. But here's the key point. All 12 tribes had a unique role to play in God's divine plan for Israel, and ultimately for the world. They were the carriers of God's law, his presence, and his promises. This was a sacred calling. And it wasn't just about a group of people living in a particular land. It was about the covenant between God and his people, a covenant that still has relevance for us today. 2. The kingdom of Israel and the fall of the northern kingdom. As we move forward in the story, we see the rise of the kingdom of Israel. After the reign of King Saul, David became king and united the 12 tribes under one banner, establishing a unified Israel. His son Solomon, known for his wisdom and wealth, built the great temple in Jerusalem. It was a glorious time, a time of peace and prosperity. But this golden age wouldn't last forever. After Solomon's death, the kingdom was divided. The 10 northern tribes, Israel, broke away from the 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin. From this point, the story of Israel takes a sharp turn. The kingdom of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, became independent, but soon faced division and moral decay. They turned away from God, worshipped idols, and embraced practices that were foreign to God's will. It's in this context that we see the beginning of Israel's downfall. Despite prophets like Elijah and Elisha calling the people back to faithfulness, Israel's kings continued to lead the people into sin. It wasn't long before Israel's fate was sealed. In 722 BC, the Assyrians, an empire known for its brutal conquests, invaded the northern kingdom. The 10 tribes were defeated and the people were exiled to Assyria. The Bible tells us that the Assyrians took them away to foreign lands, and they were never seen again. They were scattered, lost in the pages of history. The Assyrian exile marked the end of the northern kingdom and the beginning of what we know as the lost tribes of Israel. But here's the thing. The tribes weren't completely lost in the sense of being obliterated. Instead, they were absorbed into the Assyrian Empire, mixed with other peoples, and gradually disappeared from the historical narrative. These tribes were no longer a distinct political entity, but they remained spiritually tied to Israel, and their legacy lived on in ways we are still discovering today. God's promise to the Israelites wasn't negated by this exile. It was a moment of judgment, yes, but also a moment of prophecy, a promise that the tribes would one day be restored. Even in their scattering, God had not forgotten them. And in the centuries since, the mystery of where they went, and whether they still exist today, has fueled countless theories, stories, and discoveries. As Christians, we must ask ourselves, what does it mean that the tribes were lost, yet not forgotten? What does it tell us about God's faithfulness and His promises, even when we can't see the full picture? The answer lies not just in history, but in the hope of restoration. Hope that no matter how far we stray, God's plans are not thwarted. Just as He promised to restore Israel, He will restore His people, both Israel and the Gentiles, through Christ. 3. Biblical prophecies concerning the lost tribes. The story of the lost tribes of Israel isn't just a tale of ancient history. It's one that's intertwined with God's eternal plan for His people, a plan that stretches beyond time and touches us today. To understand the true significance of the lost tribes, we need to look at the biblical prophecies that foretold their scattering, and more importantly, their eventual restoration. From the very beginning, God told Israel that their destiny would be shaped by their faithfulness. In Deuteronomy 28, Moses lays out blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. These blessings were promises of prosperity, peace, and divine favor. But the curses were just as real: destruction, exile, and dispersion. God warned Israel that if they turned away from Him, they would be scattered among the nations. But despite the warnings, Israel didn't heed God's commands. They worshipped false gods, turned to idols, and broke their covenant with God. In 722 BC, the prophecy of scattering came to pass. The Assyrians invaded, and the 10 northern tribes were exiled. It was a moment of judgment, but it was also part of a much bigger picture, a divine plan for Israel's ultimate restoration. In the midst of these dark times, God gave the prophets visions of hope. One of the most notable passages comes from the prophet Isaiah. In Isaiah 11:11-12, God declares, "In that day the Lord will reach out His hand a second time to reclaim the surviving remnant of His people. He will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel." This is a promise of regathering. God would not forget His people. even though they had been scattered. This promise is echoed in Ezekiel 37, in the famous vision of the Valley of Dry Bones. In this vision, God shows Ezekiel a valley full of dry bones, representing the scattered and lifeless Israelites. God tells Ezekiel to prophesy to the bones, and as he does, they come together, covered with flesh, and are brought to life. God says, "I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land." Ezekiel 37:14. This vision was not just for ancient Israel, it's a symbol of God's ultimate plan to restore his people, physically, spiritually, and eternally. But the most powerful prophecy regarding the lost tribes can be found in the book of Hosea. In Hosea 1:10, God promises that the descendants of Israel will one day be as numerous as the grains of sand, where it was said to them, "You are not my people." They will be called children of the living God. This is a prophecy not just of Israel's restoration, but also of the inclusion of Gentiles, those who were once lost to the covenant, into the family of God. And for Christians, the New Testament connects all of these promises. Jesus himself, the Messiah, is the fulfillment of the promises made to Israel. In his life, death, and resurrection, Jesus opened the door for both Jews and Gentiles to be reconciled to God, to be a part of the true Israel, the Israel of God. While the lost tribes were scattered, the message of Christ has gone out to all nations, and in him we are all given the opportunity to be grafted into God's family. These prophecies remind us that God's plans are not limited by time, geography, or even our human understanding. The lost tribes may have been scattered, but they were never lost to God. His promises remain true, and the day of restoration is coming, whether that happens through physical regathering or through the spiritual awakening of his people. 4. The journey of the lost tribes, theories and evidence. So, where did the lost tribes go? This question has fascinated historians, theologians, and explorers for centuries. As the 10 northern tribes of Israel were exiled and scattered across the Assyrian Empire, they vanished from the historical record. But that doesn't mean they disappeared completely. Over time, countless theories have emerged about where the lost tribes might have ended up. And while we may never have a definitive answer, there is fascinating evidence and intriguing connections that suggest they didn't just vanish into oblivion. Let's start with one of the most popular theories, that the lost tribes migrated eastward. In ancient times, the Assyrian Empire stretched from modern-day Iraq and Syria, parts of Iran and Turkey. After the exile, some of the Israelites likely moved further east, beyond the reach of Assyrian control. Some historians suggest that these tribes could have migrated to areas like Persia, Afghanistan, or even India, where they assimilated into various cultures and left behind traces of their Israelite heritage. One of the most fascinating connections is with the Pashtuns, an ethnic group primarily living in Afghanistan and Pakistan. There are several theories that suggest the Pashtuns might be descended from the lost tribes of Israel, particularly from the tribe of Joseph. This theory is based on linguistic, cultural, and even religious similarities between the Pashtuns and ancient Israelite customs. The Pashtuns are known for their strong code of law, known as Pashtunwali, which bears striking similarities to the laws of Moses. Additionally, some Pashtun tribes have a tradition of claiming descent from the Israelites. Then there's the fascinating story of the Beta Israel, also known as the Ethiopian Jews. For centuries, the Beta Israel have lived in Ethiopia, maintaining a unique form of Judaism, distinct from the rest of the Jewish world. Many believe that the Beta Israel are descendants of the tribe of Dan, one of the 10 lost tribes. In the late 20th century, thousands of Ethiopian Jews were airlifted to Israel in a series of operations, where they were recognized as part of the Jewish people. Their claim to be a lost tribe has been the subject of much debate, but the connection is undeniable. Further west, there are theories that the lost tribes made their way to Europe. The Celtic peoples, for example, have long been linked to the lost tribes. Some suggest that the Celts, who have a unique cultural heritage, including ancient symbols that resemble those of Israel, could be the descendants of the tribes of Gad, Naphtali, or Issachar. Interestingly, in the British Isles, some families have traced their genealogies back to the biblical figures of the Old Testament, including King David. And let's not forget the fascinating connection to the Americas. Some have theorized that the Native American tribes may have connections to the lost tribes of Israel. In the Book of Mormon, for example, there is a story of a group of Israelites who sailed to the Americas, establishing a civilization long before European colonization. While these ideas are controversial, they are part of a larger conversation about the scattered people of Israel and how their legacy might have continued through the centuries. Of course, there's no concrete evidence to definitively prove that any of these groups are descendants of the lost tribes. The truth is, the whereabouts of the lost tribes remain one of history's greatest mysteries, but that doesn't mean they're lost in the eyes of God. If anything, their scattered existence only strengthens the message of hope that God can restore his people, no matter where they are or how far they've wandered. The mystery of the lost tribes challenges us to think deeply about God's faithfulness to his promises and his plan to bring all people, Jew and Gentile, into his family. Whether through physical regathering or spiritual awakening, the lost tribes will one day be brought back into the fold, fulfilling the promises made so long ago. And in that restoration, we see a powerful picture of God's love for his people. No one is ever truly lost to him. 5. The Christian perspective. So, you might be wondering, why should this matter to me as a Christian? What does the story of the lost tribes of Israel have to do with my faith and my walk with Christ? Great questions, because the story of the lost tribes is deeply tied to God's plan for all of us, and as believers in Christ, we are woven into that plan. The scattered tribes aren't just an ancient mystery. They represent God's ongoing work in the world, his unbreakable covenant with his people, and the fulfillment of the promises he made through Jesus. First and foremost, we must understand that the promises made to Israel, even in their scattering, are not just for the Jews. As Christians, we are grafted into the promises of Israel through Jesus Christ. Paul makes this clear in Romans 11:17-18, when he writes about the Gentiles being grafted into the olive tree of Israel. This means that God's covenant with the tribes of Israel now extends to all who believe in Jesus Christ, regardless of our heritage or background. But let's get a little deeper. The lost tribes embody a powerful spiritual lesson for us as believers. When Israel was scattered, it seemed like God's promises were in jeopardy. But time and again, God demonstrated that even in the darkest moments, when Israel was scattered to the winds, his promises were still secure. God didn't forget his people, and he will never forget them. In the same way, as Christians, we can take great comfort in knowing that no matter how far we stray, no matter how scattered we may feel, God is always calling us back. Jesus himself spoke of the lost sheep and how he leaves the 99 to find the one that has gone astray, Luke 15:3-7. That's the heart of God's covenant love. He pursues, he restores, and he gathers his people together, even when they are far off. Furthermore, the restoration of the lost tribes is a powerful reminder that God's work is far from finished. The scattering of Israel, their exile, and eventual restoration aren't just events that belong to the past. They point toward a future hope, a future where God's kingdom will be established in full. As Christians, we believe that Christ will return to bring ultimate restoration, not only to Israel, but to the entire world. The lost tribes, scattered but not forgotten, are part of God's grand narrative of redemption that will culminate in the return of Christ. For us, this isn't just some distant historical event. The story of the lost tribes is an invitation to trust in God's promises, to recognize his faithfulness, and to understand that we, as part of God's people, are included in that promise. The scattered tribes are a picture of God's relentless love and faithfulness to all who believe. So why should we care? Because the story of the lost tribes is not only about Israel's past, it's about God's ongoing work in the world today. It's about our shared faith and the fact that no one is ever truly lost to God. His love, His promises, and His plans are bigger than we can imagine, and we are invited to be part of it. 6. The return of the lost tribes. Signs of the end times. Let's step into the future. When we talk about the lost tribes of Israel, we're not just talking about something that happened in the distant past. This is a story that is still unfolding. In fact, one of the most intriguing questions for many Christians is whether the return of the lost tribes is somehow tied to the end times and the second coming of Christ. The Bible is clear that God's plan for Israel isn't finished. He has promised that He will regather His people from the nations and bring them back to their land. In Ezekiel 37:21-22, God declares, "I will take the Israelites out of the nations. I will bring them back to their own land. I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel." This is a promise of regathering, a promise that, despite Israel's long history of exile, God will bring His people back together. Now let's be clear. The return of the lost tribes isn't necessarily about a physical return to Israel alone. While that's part of it, the regathering also refers to a spiritual awakening. In fact, we see this prophecy already beginning to unfold today. The establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948 is a fulfillment of God's promises to restore the Jewish people to their land. But this return is not just political, it's spiritual as well. More and more Jewish people from all over the world are returning to Israel, and many are rediscovering their faith in God in a new way. But what about the 10 lost tribes specifically? As we saw earlier, many theories and claims suggest that groups such as the Beta Israel in Ethiopia, the Pashtuns in Afghanistan, and even some Native American tribes could be descendants of the lost tribes. If this is true, could their return to the fold be a part of God's prophetic plan? Many believe that, as the final days approach, God will reveal the identity of these lost tribes and bring them back into His family. This connects directly with the New Testament's vision of the end times. In Matthew 24:31, Jesus speaks of the angels gathering His elect from the four winds from one end of the heavens to the other. The regathering of Israel, both physically and spiritually, is one of the signs of the fulfillment of God's kingdom on earth. In the book of Revelation, we see the 144,000, a symbolic number, of Israel being sealed and prepared for God's final purposes. These tribes will be part of the final victorious community of God's people. For us as Christians, the return of the lost tribes is not just a curiosity or a historical puzzle. It's a sign of hope. It's a sign that God's plan is coming to completion. It reminds us that God keeps His promises and that His kingdom will one day be fully realized. In the end, the story of the lost tribes of Israel is not just about what happened in the past. It's about what is happening right now and what will come to pass in the future. The regathering of Israel is a living, breathing part of God's plan, and as believers, we are part of that plan. We should live with the anticipation that God is still bringing His people home, still gathering those who have been scattered. The return of the lost tribes is a reminder that God's kingdom is coming, and that Christ will return to restore all things, Israel, the nations, and all of creation. The story is far from over. In fact, it's only just beginning. 7. Real-life examples and modern-day connections. As fascinating as the ancient history of the lost tribes of Israel is, the story doesn't end in the past. In fact, some of the most compelling evidence for the survival and restoration of the lost tribes comes from the present day. There are still groups and people across the world who claim to be descendants of the lost tribes, and many of these connections have captured the attention of historians, theologians, and Christians alike. Let's take a look at some of the most well-known examples of modern-day groups that believe they are connected to the lost tribes of Israel. These stories are not just historical relics, they're living testaments to God's promises and the ongoing fulfillment of His plan. 1. The Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jews. One of the most well-known groups that claim descent from the lost tribes is the Beta Israel, or Ethiopian Jews. These people have lived in Ethiopia for centuries, practicing a form of Judaism that predates the establishment of the modern state of Israel. While their exact origins are debated, many believe that they are descendants of the tribe of Dan, one of the 10 lost tribes. For centuries, the Beta Israel maintained their Jewish faith, even when they were isolated from the rest of the Jewish world. They kept many practices that aligned with the Old Testament, including circumcision, kosher dietary laws, and the observance of the Sabbath. Despite their isolation, their connection to the ancient Israelites remained intact. In the late 20th century, after years of persecution and hardship in Ethiopia, thousands of Beta Israel were airlifted to Israel in operations known as Operation Moses and Operation Solomon. This was a significant moment in the regathering of God's people. Their arrival in Israel was not just a political event. It was a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, showing that God was bringing His scattered people back to their land. 2. The Pashtuns, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Another fascinating group with ties to the lost tribes is the Pashtuns, an ethnic group found in Afghanistan and Pakistan. For centuries, there have been theories that the Pashtuns are descendants of the tribe of Joseph, specifically the tribe of Ephraim. There are several reasons why this theory has gained traction. First, the Pashtun people have a unique culture that includes practices and customs that are strikingly similar to those of ancient Israelites. For example, their traditional code of law, known as Pashtunwali, bears a resemblance to the laws of Moses. They also have a long history of tribal leadership, much like the Israelite system of tribal leaders in the Old Testament. Additionally, some Pashtun families have oral traditions that claim descent from the 10 lost tribes. These stories are not universally accepted, but the persistence of these traditions over the centuries adds weight to the idea that the Pashtuns may be linked to Israel in some way. Moreover, there are certain Jewish practices among the Pashtuns, such as the observance of the Sabbath and circumcision, that further fuel speculation about their ancestral ties to the lost tribes. 3. The Native American tribes. The idea that Native American tribes could be descended from the lost tribes of Israel is a controversial and debated topic. Nevertheless, there are some fascinating connections that have been pointed out over the years. Many Native American tribes have oral traditions that speak of a time when their ancestors came from a distant land, often referred to as the land of the Great Spirit or the land of the sun. Some historians and researchers have suggested that these traditions could point to the Israelites who were scattered during the Assyrian exile. There are also linguistic similarities between certain Native American languages and ancient Hebrew, though these connections are tenuous at best. Still, the idea of a Jewish connection to Native American tribes has captured the imagination of many believers, especially when considering the biblical promise that God would gather His scattered people from the four corners of the earth. 4. The Japanese and their claim to Israelite descent. One of the more surprising claims regarding the lost tribes is the idea that the Japanese people are descended from the Israelites. Some scholars have pointed to linguistic and cultural similarities between the ancient Israelites and the Japanese, including shared customs like bowing, a respect for elders, and the use of a calendar based on lunar cycles. Additionally, There are stories in Japanese folklore that speak of a group of people who arrived in Japan from a distant land, carrying with them sacred scrolls and symbols of faith. Some have suggested that these ancient stories may be echoes of the Israelites' journey to distant lands after their exile. While these claims remain highly speculative and are not widely accepted in mainstream scholarship, the possibility of such connections adds another layer to the mystery of the lost tribes and their potential survival in unexpected places. 5. The B'nai Menashe, India and Myanmar. The B'nai Menashe are a group of people from northeastern India and Myanmar who believe they are descendants of the tribe of Manasseh, one of the 10 lost tribes. The B'nai Menashe have long practiced a form of Judaism, and they trace their ancestry back to Israel, claiming that their forefathers were part of the Assyrian exile. In recent decades, thousands of B'nai Menashe have made Aliyah, immigrated, to Israel, where they have been recognized as Jews and integrated into Israeli society. Their story is another example of how the lost tribes may have survived and maintained their identity, even in far-off lands. These are just a few examples of the many groups around the world who claim to be descendants of the lost tribes. While we may never know the full extent of their connections, these stories serve as a powerful reminder of God's faithfulness and His promise to regather His people from all corners of the earth. In the same way, the spiritual descendants of the lost tribes, believers in Jesus Christ, both Jew and Gentile, are being gathered together by God's grace and mercy as part of the new covenant through Christ. 8. Theological reflection. What does it mean to be lost and found? The story of the lost tribes isn't just about a group of people who wandered off and lost their way. It's about God's redemptive work in the world. It's about the deep spiritual truth that no one is ever too far gone for God to find. The lost tribes represent the profound mystery of God's love for His people, His chosen people, and His relentless pursuit of them, even when they have been scattered far and wide. Jesus Himself spoke about the theme of being lost and found. In the parable of the lost sheep, He tells the story of a shepherd who leaves his 99 sheep to search for the one that is lost. When he finds it, he rejoices, saying, "Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep." Luke 15:6. This parable speaks not only of Israel's spiritual journey, but of the heart of God, who desires to bring back every single one of His people, no matter how far they have gone. This same message applies to us today. The lost tribes are not just a historical mystery. They represent every person who feels spiritually lost, disconnected, or forgotten. Whether we are physically lost or spiritually estranged, God's love and His calling are always there, waiting to bring us back into His fold. The story of the lost tribes teaches us that no matter how lost we may feel, God is faithful. His plans are bigger than our failures or our distance from Him. The tribes may have been scattered, but they were never forgotten. And in the same way, we as Christians can take comfort in knowing that God will never abandon us. No matter how far we stray, we are always within His reach. Conclusion: the ongoing journey of the lost tribes. As we reflect on the story of the lost tribes of Israel, we can't help but see a greater picture unfolding. A picture that stretches across time and points to a future hope. The lost tribes are not just an ancient mystery. They are part of a living story, a story that includes us as believers in Christ. God's promises to Israel are not just for the Jews. They are for all who are part of His family through Jesus Christ. The regathering of the lost tribes is part of God's grand plan for redemption, a plan that will one day be fulfilled when Christ returns. So, let us live with the anticipation that God is still at work, regathering His scattered people from all corners of the earth. The story of the lost tribes is a story of hope, a story that reminds us that no one is ever too far gone, no one is ever beyond the reach of God's love. As we wait for that day, let us be faithful, trusting that God's promises are sure and that His plan will come to completion. The lost tribes may be scattered, but they are not forgotten. And one day, we will see them, along with all of God's people, gathered together in the fullness of His glory.